The morning sun cast golden rays through the towering windows of Belmont Palace, illuminating the marble corridors where servants hurried about their duties. Isabel Laurent adjusted her starched white apron one final time before knocking on the heavy oak door of the Duke's study. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It had been exactly 1 week since she'd been hired as personal maid to the mysterious Duke Alexander von Habsburg, and still, his presence made her breath catch in her throat. "Enter," came the deep, commanding voice from within. Isabel pushed open the door to find the Duke standing with his back to her, gazing out at the sprawling gardens where servants were already preparing for tonight's grand annual ball. Alexander von Habsburg was an imposing figure, even in silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, with perfectly styled black hair that caught the morning light. When he turned to face her, those piercing blue-gray eyes seemed to look straight through to her soul. "Good morning, Your Grace," Isabel said, dropping into a perfect curtsy. "I've brought your morning tea and the correspondence from London." Alexander's gaze lingered on her face for a moment longer than propriety dictated. There was something about this young woman that unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. Her chestnut golden hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, revealing the graceful curve of her neck, and those emerald eyes held an intelligence that seemed to pierce through his carefully constructed walls. "Set it on the desk," he said, his voice softer now. "Tell me, Miss Laurent, how are you finding your position here at Belmont?" Isabel carefully arranged the silver tea service, acutely aware of his intense scrutiny. "It's an honor to serve in such a magnificent estate, Your Grace, though I must admit the other servants seem cautious around you." A shadow crossed Alexander's features, and he turned back to the window. "Cautious is a kind word for it. Most would say they're terrified." His voice carried a weight of loneliness that made Isabel's heart ache. Perhaps they have reason to be. Before Isabel could respond, the study door burst open. Lady Victoria Ashworth swept in wearing a morning gown of pale blue silk that perfectly matched her cold eyes. Her platinum blonde curls were already elaborately styled despite the early hour, adorned with pearl pins that caught the light. "Alexander, darling," Victoria purred, barely glancing at Isabel. "I've come to discuss the arrangements for tonight's ball. Surely you're not still planning to open the dancing with that tedious old tradition?" Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The von Habsburg family has opened every grand ball the same way for 3 centuries, Victoria. I see no reason to change that now." Victoria's laugh was like tinkling glass, beautiful but sharp enough to cut. "Oh, Alexander, you're so bound by the past. Perhaps it's time to create new traditions, ... especially considering our upcoming engagement announcement." Isabel's hands stilled on the teacup she'd been arranging. Engagement? Her eyes darted between the Duke and Lady Victoria, trying to read the undercurrents in the room. Alexander's expression had gone completely neutral, but she noticed his hands clenched behind his back. "That has not been decided, Victoria," Alexander said coolly. "Hasn't it?" Victoria moved closer to him, her silk skirts rustling. "Our families arranged this match when we were children. Surely you wouldn't dishonor that agreement." Her voice dropped to a whisper that Isabel could barely hear. "Besides, we both know about your family's unique circumstances. I'm one of the few who would willingly accept such risks." Isabel saw Alexander flinch as if he'd been struck. Whatever Victoria was referring to, it cut deep. The Duke's shoulders seemed to bear an invisible weight, and for a moment he looked far older than his 29 years. "Leave us," Alexander said quietly, though Isabel wasn't sure if he was addressing her or Victoria. Victoria smiled triumphantly. "Of course, darling. I'll see you tonight." She swept past Isabel without acknowledgement, her perfume leaving a cloying trail in the air. Once they were alone, Isabel watched as Alexander slumped slightly against the window frame. The confident Duke had vanished, replaced by a man who looked utterly exhausted. "Your Grace," Isabel said softly, "is there anything I can do?" Alexander looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "You should go, Miss Laurent. You have duties to attend to, and tonight's ball will require all hands." But Isabel didn't move. Something in his voice and the defeated set of his shoulders made her forget every rule about propriety she'd ever learned. "You mentioned your family's unique circumstances, if I may be so bold. Is that why the other servants are afraid?" Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and Isabel was certain she'd overstepped. Then, to her surprise, he let out a bitter laugh. "You're very perceptive, Miss Laurent. Yes, that's exactly why they're afraid." He moved to his desk, picking up a silver letter opener and turning it over in his hands. "Tell me, what do you know about curses?" The question was so unexpected that Isabel blinked. "Curses, Your Grace. My family has been ... afflicted ... for generations. Everyone who gets close to a von Habsburg dies. Not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Isabel could hear the pain underneath. My parents, my previous valets, even a childhood friend who dared to care for me. All dead before their time. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine, but not from fear. Instead, she felt an overwhelming wave of compassion for this man who carried such a terrible burden. That's why you keep everyone at a distance. It's why I must, Alexander said firmly, and why you should request a transfer to another position in the household. I shouldn't have allowed Mrs. Pembroke to assign you as my personal maid. It was selfish of me. What if I don't want to transfer? The words left Isabel's mouth before she could stop them. Alexander's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. You don't understand what you're saying, don't I? Isabel stepped closer, her emerald eyes flashing with determination. You're asking me to abandon you because of some superstition? It's not superstition. Alexander slammed the letter opener down on the desk, making Isabel jump. It's real, Miss Laurent. As real as the breath in your lungs. I've seen it happen too many times to doubt it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Isabel spoke, her voice gentle but unwavering. Then I suppose we'll just have to be very careful, won't we? Alexander stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Isabel straightened her shoulders, every inch the determined young woman who had survived being orphaned and raised in a convent. Everyone deserves to have someone who cares about them, Your Grace. Even cursed dukes. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made Isabel's pulse quicken. You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Laurent. Perhaps both, she said with a small smile. Now shall I help you prepare for tonight's ball? I suspect you'll need all your strength to face whatever Lady Victoria has planned. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparations. Isabel threw herself into her duties with renewed purpose, helping coordinate the arrival of flowers from the gardens, ensuring Alexander's formal attire was pressed to perfection, and trying to ignore the way her heart skipped whenever their fingers accidentally brushed as she handed him documents or refreshments. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western hills, the palace transformed into something magical. Hundreds of roses were arranged in elaborate displays throughout the ballroom and gardens. Musicians tuned their instruments in the corner of the grand hall, and servants in their finest livery bustled about with silver trays and crystal glasses. Isabel was adjusting the final touches on Alexander's appearance, his blue navy coat with gold embroidery, the white silk vest, and the military decorations that caught the light with every movement, when Mrs. Catherine Pembroke knocked on the door. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, the elderly governess said, her gray eyes twinkling with excitement. But the first guests are arriving. Alexander nodded, then turned to Isabel. Thank you, Miss Laurent. You should go prepare yourself for the evening's duties. But as Isabel moved toward the door, Alexander's voice stopped her. Miss Laurent? When she turned, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Be careful tonight.
Maid!
I have a feeling that not everything will go as planned. A shiver of foreboding ran through Isabel, but she simply nodded. I'll be careful, Your Grace. You should be as well. The grand annual ball at Belmont Palace was a sight to behold. The gardens were illuminated with hundreds of lanterns that cast a warm golden glow over the assembled nobility. Ladies in elaborate gowns of every color imaginable strolled arm in arm with gentlemen in their finest evening wear. The sound of laughter and conversation mingled with the gentle strains of a string quartet, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. Isabel moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, ensuring glasses were filled and guests were comfortable, but her eyes kept drifting to Alexander. He stood near the main terrace, resplendent in his formal attire, accepting congratulations and making polite conversation with the endless stream of nobles who approached him. Lady Victoria remained attached to his arm like an ornamental accessory, her rose-colored gown with gold embroidery making her look like a princess from a fairy tale. But Isabel could see what others missed, the tension in Alexander's shoulders, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, and how his gaze occasionally swept the crowd as if searching for potential threats. Whatever he was worried about, it was making him increasingly on edge as the evening progressed. Quite a spectacle, isn't it? Isabel turned to find Lord Edmund Blackthorne standing beside her. The Duke's cousin cut an impressive figure in his red military dress uniform, but something about his dark eyes made Isabel uncomfortable. Yes, my lord. The Duke has outdone himself this year, she replied politely. Edmund's smile didn't reach his eyes. Alexander always did have a flair for the dramatic. Tell me, Miss Laurent, it is Miss Laurent, isn't it? How are you finding your position as his personal maid? There was something in his tone that made Isabel wary. I'm honored to serve the Duke, my lord. Of course you are, Edmund said smoothly, though I imagine it can be challenging working so closely with someone of Alexander's particular temperament. He's not known for his warm disposition. Isabel bristled at the criticism. The Duke has been nothing but kind to me, Lord Blackthorne, has he? Edmund raised an eyebrow. How refreshing. Perhaps you bring out his better nature. His gaze swept over her appraisingly. You know, there's something quite striking about you. Has anyone ever told you that you have the look of someone special? Someone powerful? Before Isabel could ask what he meant, the music stopped abruptly. Alexander stood at the center of the main terrace, raising his glass to address the assembled guests. The crowd fell silent, turning their attention to their host. My lords and ladies, Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, welcome to Belmont Palace. It is my honor to continue the tradition my family has maintained for 3 centuries, the grand annual ball that celebrates not just our estate, but the bonds of friendship and loyalty that unite us all. Polite applause rippled through the crowd, but Isabel noticed that Alexander's eyes were scanning the assembly with increasing tension. What was he looking for? As is traditional, Alexander continued, I would like to invite Lady Victoria Ashworth to join me for the opening dance. Victoria practically glowed as she stepped forward, her hand extended gracefully toward Alexander. But as the Duke moved to take her hand, Isabel saw something that made her blood run cold. A servant in palace livery, one she didn't recognize, was approaching Alexander's table where his wineglass sat unattended. The man's movements were furtive, and as he passed the table, Isabel saw him sprinkle something into the glass from a small vial concealed in his palm. Without thinking, Isabel pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. The opening strains of the waltz had begun, and Alexander and Victoria were moving into position for the dance. Any moment now, when the dance ended, he would return to that table and drink from that poisoned glass. Your Grace, Isabel called out, not caring how improper it was to interrupt. Alexander stopped mid-step, turning to her with surprise. Victoria's face twisted with anger at the interruption, and a murmur of shocked whispers spread through the crowd. Miss Laurent? Alexander said, confusion evident in his voice. What is it? Isabel's mind raced. She couldn't accuse anyone without proof, and the mysterious servant had already melted back into the crowd. There was only one thing she could do. I'm terribly sorry, Your Grace, but there's an urgent message that's just arrived from London. It requires your immediate attention. Alexander frowned, clearly skeptical, but something in Isabel's desperate eyes must have convinced him. Very well. Lady Victoria, if you would excuse me for just a moment. Victoria's smile was brittle with barely contained fury. Of course, darling. I'll be right here waiting. Alexander followed Isabel to a quieter corner of the terrace, away from the curious stares of the guests. Miss Laurent, what is this really about? There is no message from London. Your wineglass, Isabel said urgently. Someone put something in it while you were preparing for the dance. I saw a servant I didn't recognize. Poison? Alexander's expression went deadly serious. Are you certain? I saw him clearly. He sprinkled something from a small vial into your glass. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his jaw clenched as he processed this information. Then he turned back toward the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the assembled guests with new purpose. Did you see which way he went? No, he disappeared into the crowd immediately after. Then we need to find out who he was working for. Alexander's voice was grim. This isn't just about me, Miss Laurent. If someone is bold enough to attempt murder at my own ball, they won't hesitate to hurt innocent people to cover their tracks. As if summoned by his words, Lord Blackthorne appeared at Alexander's elbow. Is everything all right, cousin? You look rather pale. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine at the innocent question. There was something in Edmund's eyes, a glittering satisfaction that made her stomach turn. Just a minor household matter, Alexander replied smoothly. Nothing that can't wait until after our guests have been properly entertained. Of course, Edmund said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Quote, waiting. Victoria waiting much longer. She's quite eager to continue your dance. Alexander nodded curtly. Miss Laurent, please see to that matter we discussed, discreetly. As they made their way back toward the main gathering, Isabel caught sight of Mrs. Pembroke standing near the servants' entrance. The older woman's sharp eyes were already fixed on the wine table, and when she saw Isabel approaching, she nodded almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Pembroke, Isabel said quietly, we need to remove the Duke's wineglass immediately. Someone has tampered with it. The governess's expression didn't change, but Isabel saw her hands tighten on her keys. I see. And do we know who might have done such a thing? Not yet, but Miss Laurent. The voice was cold as winter frost. Isabel turned to find Lady Victoria standing directly behind her, her blue eyes blazing with fury. Might I ask why you saw fit to interrupt my dance with the Duke? Isabel straightened her shoulders, meeting Victoria's glare without flinching. There was an urgent matter that required his Grace's immediate attention, my lady. An urgent matter? Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. How convenient. Tell me, Miss Laurent, have you forgotten your place in this household? You are a servant. Your job is to remain invisible unless specifically called upon. Victoria. Alexander's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He had returned without either woman noticing, and his expression was thunderous. Miss Laurent was acting on my direct orders. Perhaps you should concern yourself with matters that actually require your attention. Victoria's face went white, then flushed deep red. Of course, Alexander, forgive me. I simply didn't want to see you taken advantage of by staff who might overstep their bounds. The warning in her voice was unmistakable, but Isabel refused to be intimidated. I would never presume to overstep, my lady. I serve at His Grace's pleasure and follow his instructions without question. How admirable, Victoria said with false sweetness. Such loyalty is rare among the servant class. Alexander stepped between them before the situation could escalate further. The evening is still young, and our guests expect entertainment. Perhaps we should return to the dancing? But as the trio made their way back toward the main gathering, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the rose garden. Lord Edmund Blackthorne stood partially concealed behind a marble statue, his face twisted with rage. The plan had been perfect. Poison was tasteless, odorless, and would have appeared to be nothing more than a sudden heart attack, tragic, but not suspicious. By tomorrow morning he would have been Duke of Belmont, and no one would have questioned his right to the title. But that damned maid had ruined everything. Edmund's hand moved to the hilt of his ceremonial sword. Perhaps it was time for a more direct approach. After all, accidents could happen even at the most elegant social gatherings. A fall down the marble steps, a tragic mishap in the garden maze, a chandelier with a mysteriously weakened chain. The possibilities were endless. As the night progressed, the ball reached its peak of splendor. The gardens were alive with music, laughter, and the rustle of silk gowns as couples swirled across the dance floor that had been laid out on the main terrace. Lanterns cast a magical glow over everything, and the air was sweet with the scent of roses and night-blooming jasmine. Isabel continued her duties, but she remained constantly alert, watching for any sign of danger. She noticed that Mrs. Pembroke had discreetly removed Alexander's wineglass and replaced it with a fresh one, and several additional guards had been stationed around the perimeter of the gardens, so subtly that most guests wouldn't notice, but enough to make Isabel feel slightly more secure. Alexander was fulfilling his role as host with practiced ease, dancing with the ladies, discussing business with the gentlemen, and ensuring that everyone felt welcome and entertained. But Isabel could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes constantly swept the crowd and how he never turned his back on Lord Blackthorne for long. "You're watching him like a hawk," Mrs. Pembroke said quietly, appearing at Isabel's elbow with her characteristic silent grace. "Someone tried to poison him tonight," Isabel replied, not taking her eyes off the Duke. "I can't shake the feeling that they're not finished." Mrs. Pembroke nodded grimly. "You have good instincts, child. I've served this family for 20 years, and I've learned to recognize when danger is brewing." She paused, studying Isabel's profile. "You care for him." It wasn't a question, and Isabel felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He's my employer. It's my duty too, child." Mrs. Pembroke's voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen the way you look at each other. There's nothing dutiful about it." Isabel's hands trembled as she adjusted the flowers on a nearby table. "Doesn't matter how I feel. He's a duke and I'm a servant. There are rules made by men who never knew what it was to love someone beyond their reach," Mrs. Pembroke said softly. "But love has a way of making its own rules, especially when it's strong enough." Before Isabel could respond, a commotion near the garden maze caught their attention. A woman's scream pierced the night air, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. Alexander was already moving, pushing through the crowd toward the source of the disturbance. Isabel followed without thinking, her heart pounding with dread. They found Lady Margaret Fairfax, one of the evening's guests, collapsed on the ground near the entrance to the maze. Her husband was kneeling beside her, his face pale with terror. "She just collapsed," Lord Fairfax said, his voice shaking. "We were walking in the garden talking about the roses, and suddenly she grabbed her chest and fell. I don't understand. She was perfectly well just moments ago." Alexander knelt beside the unconscious woman, checking for signs of life. "She's breathing, but barely. We need to get her inside immediately." He looked up at the gathering crowd. "Someone send for a physician." As they carefully carried Lady Margaret into the palace, Isabel noticed something that made her blood run cold. The lady's wineglass lay shattered on the path where she had dropped it, and the scent rising from the spilled liquid was faintly bitter, almost like almonds. Poison. Someone had tried to poison Alexander, and when that failed, they had apparently decided to poison one of the guests instead. But why Lady Margaret? What possible motive could anyone have for harming a harmless, middle-aged woman who spent her time painting watercolors and organizing charity events? Unless she hadn't been the intended victim at all. Isabel's gaze swept the assembled crowd until she found what she was looking for. Lord Edmund Blackthorne stood at the edge of the group, his expression appropriately concerned, but his eyes held a glitter of satisfaction that made her skin crawl. He had poisoned Lady Margaret's wine by mistake, thinking it was someone else's. But whose? And why was he so pleased that an innocent woman was dying? The answer came to her like a bolt of lightning. Lady Margaret had been standing near the refreshment table, wearing a dark evening gown not unlike Isabel's own simple black dress. In the dim garden lighting from a distance, someone might easily mistake one dark-haired woman for another. Lord Blackthorne hadn't been trying to poison Lady Margaret at all. He had been trying to poison her. The realization hit her so hard that she stumbled, catching herself on a marble column. Edmund must have realized that she was the one who had discovered the first poison attempt. He was trying to eliminate the witness to his crime. Miss Laurent? Alexander appeared at her side, his face creased with concern. "Are you all right? You look as though you've seen a ghost." Isabel glanced around, ensuring they couldn't be overheard. "Your Grace, I need to speak with you privately." "It's about Lady Margaret." Alexander studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, we'll use my study." They made their way through the corridors of the palace, past portraits of long-dead von Habsburg ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to watch their passage with knowing expressions. Alexander's study was a haven of calm after the chaos of the evening, with its leather-bound books and warm firelight. "Now then," Alexander said, closing the door behind them, "tell me what has you so frightened?" Isabel took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I don't think Lady Margaret was the intended victim of the poisoning." Alexander's expression grew grave. "Go on." She was wearing a dark dress, similar to mine. "In the garden lighting, from a distance... Isabel's voice trailed off, but Alexander's sharp intake of breath told her he understood. "You think someone was trying to poison you?" His voice was deadly quiet. "But why? You're a servant. What possible threat could you pose to anyone?" "I'm the one who discovered the first poisoning attempt," Isabel said simply. "I'm a witness. If something happened to me, it would look like an accident, and no one would ever know that you were the original target." Alexander was silent for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Don't you see, Miss Laurent, this is how the curse works. It doesn't matter that you're just a servant or that we've done nothing improper. The moment you showed concern for my welfare, you became a target. This isn't a curse," Isabel said firmly. "This is someone very real and very dangerous who wants you dead. And they're using your fear of this supposed curse to make you push away anyone who might help you." "Supposed curse?" Alexander's laugh was bitter. "My parents died in a carriage accident just days after they told me how proud they were of the man I was becoming. My childhood friend drowned in the estate's lake after he gave me a birthday present. My first valet died of a fever after he told me he considered me like a son." Isabel felt tears prick at her eyes at the pain in his voice. "Those could have been coincidences, could they?" Alexander turned to face her, and she was shocked to see the anguish in his expression. "What about the woman I was supposed to marry 5 years ago? Lady Catherine Worthington, beautiful, kind, everything a duchess should be. She died 3 days after our engagement ball. Threw herself from her bedroom window, they said, though she had never shown any signs of despair or melancholy." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Finally Isabel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it wasn't suicide? What if someone killed her because they didn't want you to marry her?" Alexander stared at her as if she'd suggested the moon was made of cheese. "That's impossible." "Who would?" He stopped abruptly, his face going pale. "Edmund? Your cousin? He's second in line for the dukedom, if I die without an heir." Alexander sank into his chair, running his hands through his dark hair. "My God, how could I have been so blind? All these years. I've been so focused on protecting people from some imaginary curse that I never considered they might need protection from something far more real." Isabel moved closer, her heart breaking for the torment he'd been carrying. "It's not your fault. You were trying to protect the people you cared about the only way you knew how, by pushing them away. by making myself into a cold, distant figure that no one could get close enough to harm. Alexander looked up at her with haunted eyes. But you refused to be pushed away, didn't you? Despite everything I told you about the curse, you stayed. I stayed because you needed someone to stay, Isabel said simply. Everyone deserves to have someone who believes in them, who sees their worth beyond their title or their fears. Alexander rose from his chair slowly, moving toward her with an expression she'd never seen before. Hope mingled with something deeper, more dangerous. Miss Laurent, Isabel. Do you realize what you're saying? The use of her first name sent a shiver through her, but she didn't step back. I'm saying that I don't care about curses or social conventions or the danger. I care about you, Alexander. Not the Duke, you. The distance between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. Alexander reached out, his fingertips barely brushing her cheek as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. You magnificent, impossible woman, he said softly. Don't you understand that caring for me could cost you everything? And don't you understand that walking away from you would cost me more? The moment hung between them, fragile and precious, until a sharp knock on the study door shattered the spell. Alexander stepped back quickly, his expression shifting back to ducal composure, though Isabel could see the effort it cost him. Enter, Alexander called. Mrs. Pembroke opened the door, her usually composed expression troubled. Your Grace, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but there's been another incident. Lord Fairfax found a threatening note in his pocket. Someone saying that what happened to his wife was just the beginning. Alexander's jaw tightened. Have you informed the authorities? I've sent word to the magistrate, but it will be morning before he can arrive. Your Grace, Mrs. Pembroke's voice dropped lower. I think you should consider ending the ball early. If someone is bold enough to strike twice in one evening, you're right, of course. Alexander moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at Isabel. Miss Laurent, I want you to stay close to Mrs. Pembroke for the rest of the evening. Don't go anywhere alone, and don't accept food or drink from anyone, Your Grace. Please. The single word carried so much desperate concern that Isabel's protest died in her throat. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. The return to the ball was subdued. Word of Lady Margaret's condition had spread among the guests, casting a pall over what had been a joyous celebration. Alexander handled the situation with grace, expressing concern for the Fairfax family and suggesting that perhaps it would be best if the evening concluded early out of respect for Lady Margaret's health. Most of the guests were happy to comply, gathering their cloaks and calling for their carriages with relieved expressions. No one wanted to be present if whatever had struck down Lady Margaret was contagious. But a few guests lingered, close friends of the family and those with nowhere urgent to be. Lady Victoria was among them, of course, clinging to Alexander's arm and speaking in low, concerned tones about the terrible tragedy that had befallen such a sweet lady. Lord Edmund Blackthorne was also among those who remained, offering to help with any arrangements that might be needed, and expressing shock that such a thing could happen at Belmont Palace, of all places. These are dangerous times, he said gravely to a small group gathered around him. One hears of such random attacks on innocent people more and more frequently. Poor Lady Margaret was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Isabel, helping to clear away abandoned wine glasses and plates from the garden, felt her temper flare at his feigned concern. How dare he stand there expressing sympathy for a woman he had tried to murder? And how dare he pretend that it was some random attack when he knew perfectly well that he had been aiming for someone else entirely? She was so focused on her anger that she didn't notice the figure approaching through the shadows of the rose garden until it was too late. Miss Laurent, Lord Edmund's voice was soft, almost gentle, but something in his tone made Isabel's skin crawl. Might I have a word with you? Isabel looked around, hoping to catch sight of Mrs. Pembroke or another servant, but she was alone in this section of the garden. The main gathering had moved to the terrace on the other side of the palace, and the sound of conversation was muted by distance and the rustling of leaves. I'm afraid I have duties to attend to, my lord, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm sure they can wait a moment, Edmund said, moving closer. In the dim lantern light, his smile looked predatory. I wanted to compliment you on your quick thinking earlier this evening. Not many servants would have had the presence of mind to interrupt their masters. Dance to deliver an urgent message. There was something in the way he said urgent message that made it clear he knew she had been lying. Isabel's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to remain calm. I serve at His Grace's pleasure, my lord. When he gives me instructions, I follow them without question. Of course you do. Such admirable loyalty. Edmund had moved close enough now that Isabel could smell the wine on his breath and see the cold calculation in his dark eyes. Tell me, Miss Laurent, what exactly did you see tonight that prompted such urgent action? Isabel's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I'm afraid I don't understand, my lord." "Don't you?" Edmund's hand moved to rest on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. "I think you understand perfectly. You saw something you shouldn't have seen, and now you're a problem that needs to be solved." Fear shot through Isabel like ice water, but with it came a crystalline clarity. She was alone in the garden with a murderer, and no one knew where she was. Her only chance was to keep him talking until someone missed her. "If you're referring to the incident with Lady Margaret," she said carefully, "I only saw her collapse, just like everyone else. But before that," Edmund said softly, "before poor Lady Margaret had her unfortunate accident." "What did you see then?" Isabel lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I saw you trying to murder the Duke." Edmund's smile widened, and Isabel realized with horror that her honesty had been a mistake. He had been fishing for information, and she had just confirmed that she was indeed a witness to his crime. "There we are," he said pleasantly. "I do appreciate directness in a woman. It saves so much time." His hand tightened on his sword hilt. "Now, Miss Laurent, I'm afraid we have a problem. You see, I can't have you running to Alexander with tales of attempted murder. It would quite ruin my plans." "What plans?" Isabel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "To become the Duke of Belmont, of course. It's my birthright, you see. Alexander's father stole it from my branch of the family with his clever politics and strategic marriages. But I intend to reclaim what should have been mine from the beginning." Edmund drew his sword slowly, the metal singing softly in the night air. "Alexander should have died years ago, along with his parents, but he proved surprisingly resilient. No matter, tonight will be the end of it." Isabel backed away slowly, her mind racing. The garden maze was behind her, but she knew that would only trap her. Her only hope was to reach the main terrace where the remaining guests were gathered. "You killed his parents," she said, not really a question. A loose wheel on their carriage, so tragic, so accidental. Edmund advanced on her with predatory grace. And poor Catherine Worthington, overcome with despair at her engagement to a cursed man. Amazing how far a woman will fall when pushed from a high enough window. Isabel's blood ran cold. "You created the curse. All those deaths, all that guilt Alexander carries, it was you. Orchestrating everything to make him believe he was dangerous to anyone who cared for him. Brilliant, wasn't it? Much easier to kill people when the intended victim isolates himself out of guilt and fear." Edmund's laugh was chilling. "I must admit, you've complicated things considerably. Alexander was finally ready to marry Victoria, a marriage that would have produced no heirs, given her particular medical limitations. But then you arrived, and suddenly he's looking at you like you hung the moon and stars." The blade of Edmund's sword caught the lantern light as he raised it. "I cannot allow that to continue." Isabel turned and ran. Behind her she heard Edmund curse and give chase, but she had the advantage of knowing the garden better than he did. She dodged between rose bushes and around marble statues, her heart pounding as his footsteps thundered after her. A shot of pain lanced through her shoulder as a low branch caught her, tearing her dress and scratching her skin, but she didn't slow down. She could see the lights of the main terrace ahead, hear the murmur of conversation. Safety was just a few dozen yards away. But Edmund was faster than she had anticipated. Just as she reached the edge of the formal garden, his hand closed on her arm, spinning her around. "Enough," he snarled, raising his sword. "Edmund, what the devil do you think you're doing?" Alexander's voice cut through the night like a whip crack. He stood at the entrance to the garden path, still in his formal evening wear, but his expression was deadly. Behind him stood Mrs. Pembroke and two of the palace guards. Edmund's grip on Isabel's arm tightened painfully. "Alexander, how convenient. You've saved me the trouble of hunting you down." "Let her go," Alexander said, his voice deceptively calm. "Your quarrel is with me, not her." "Oh, but it is with her now," Edmund said, pressing the tip of his sword to Isabel's throat. She felt the cold metal against her skin and forced herself not to move. "You see, dear cousin, Miss Laurent knows far too much about my activities this evening. She's become a liability." Alexander's eyes met Isabel's across the space between them, and she saw something in his gaze that she had never seen before. Pure, undiluted fury. "If you harm one hair on her head," Alexander said softly, "I will destroy you." Edmund laughed. "How touching. The cursed Duke finally admitting he cares for someone. Don't worry, Alexander. You won't have to live with the guilt of her death for very long. You'll be joining her shortly." "I don't think so." The voice came from behind Edmund. Lady Victoria stepped out of the shadows, but she looked nothing like the elegant lady who had graced the ball earlier. Her elaborate coiffure was disheveled, her rose-colored gown was torn and stained, and in her hands was a pistol that looked far too large and deadly for her delicate appearance. Edmund spun around, dragging Isabel with him. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" "Stopping you from ruining everything," Victoria said coldly. "Do you have any idea how long I've worked to position myself as Alexander's bride? How carefully I've planned every detail of our future together?" "Victoria," Alexander said, confusion evident in his voice. "What's going on?" Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Oh, Alexander, you really are beautifully naive. Did you honestly think I didn't know about your precious curse? About how Edmund has been systematically murdering anyone who gets too close to you?" Edmund's face had gone pale. "You knew?" "Of course I knew. I've known for years." Victoria's grip on the pistol never wavered. "The question is, why did you think tonight was an appropriate time to deviate from our arrangement?" "Our arrangement?" Alexander looked between his cousin and his intended bride with dawning horror. "Victoria, tell me you haven't been complicit." "Oh, darling, I've been so much more than complicit." Victoria's smile was beautiful and terrible. "Who do you think suggested that poor Catherine Worthington should spend some time alone on her balcony to contemplate her upcoming marriage? Who do you think told Edmund exactly when your parents would be traveling the old mountain road?" Isabel felt Edmund's grip on her arm loosen as shock overtook him. "You said you only wanted Alexander isolated, not dead." I said whatever was necessary to get your cooperation," Victoria cut him off. "But you were taking too long, and Alexander was starting to show interest in unsuitable persons," her cold gaze fixed on Isabel. "I cannot allow that." "So you decided to eliminate me yourself," Isabel said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Not you specifically," Victoria said with casual cruelty. "Anyone who threatened to break through Alexander's carefully constructed walls. You just happened to be the most recent threat." Alexander took a step forward. "Victoria, this is madness. Why? If you wanted to marry me so badly, why orchestrate the deaths of innocent people?" Victoria's expression softened, and for a moment she looked almost vulnerable. "Because I love you, you fool. I've loved you since we were children, and I was willing to do anything, to make you mine." "This isn't love," Alexander said, his voice heavy with disgust. "This is obsession. Call it what you like," Victoria said, raising the pistol. "The result is the same. We will be married, Alexander, and we will rule the dukedom together. All I need to do is eliminate the obstacles." She turned the gun toward Isabel. Several things happened at once. Alexander lunged forward with a roar of rage. Edmund, apparently deciding that his partnership with Victoria had come to an end, shoved Isabel toward the rose bushes and raised his sword toward the woman who had betrayed him. Mrs. Pembroke shouted for the guards, and Isabel, falling backward into the thorny embrace of the roses, felt something snap inside her, some barrier she had carried her entire life without even knowing it was there. The world exploded into light. It wasn't physical light exactly, but something that emanated from within her, washing over the garden like a wave of pure energy. Everyone present froze as if caught in amber. Victoria with her finger on the trigger, Alexander mid-lunge, Edmund with his sword half raised. But Isabel could move. She could see everything with perfect clarity. The threads of malice and obsession that connected Victoria to the years of carefully orchestrated deaths, the bitter jealousy that had driven Edmund to murder his own family members, and underneath it all, like a poison that had seeped into the very stones of Belmont Palace, the lingering effects of genuine dark magic. There had been a curse, Isabel realized with crystal clarity. Not the one Alexander believed in. Not some family affliction that killed anyone who cared for him, but something far older and more specific. A curse placed on the estate itself, designed to ensure that the von Habsburg line would end in misery and isolation. But curses, Isabel discovered, could be broken by someone with the right gift and the right motivation. She stood up slowly, thorns falling away from her torn dress like discarded jewelry. The light that surrounded her wasn't visible to the others. She could tell by their expressions that they saw only the familiar garden, but she could feel it flowing through her, warm and powerful and utterly right. With a gesture that felt as natural as breathing, Isabel reached out and began to unweave the curse. It wasn't easy. The magic had been in place for generations, twisted through the very foundations of the estate like poisonous roots. But Isabel found that her gift, the ability to see through deceptions and lies that she had carried since childhood, extended to magical deceptions as well. Thread by thread, she pulled apart the curse that had plagued the von Habsburg family for so long. And as she did, she felt the oppressive weight that had hung over Belmont Palace begin to lift. The others came back to awareness gradually. Victoria blinked in confusion, the pistol wavering in her hands as if she couldn't remember why she was holding it. Edmund lowered his sword, looking around the garden as if seeing it for the first time. But Alexander's gaze was fixed on Isabel, and in his eyes she saw wonder, recognition, and something that made her heart soar. "The curse," he said softly. "It's gone. I can feel it, like a weight I've carried so long I forgot it was there, and now it's just gone." Isabel nodded, swaying slightly from the effort of what she had done. "It was real, but it wasn't what you thought. It wasn't about people who cared for you dying. It was about ensuring you would always be alone, always isolated, always believing yourself to be dangerous. And you broke it," Alexander said with awe. "Love broke it," Isabel corrected. "Real love, the kind that sees through lies and refuses to be defeated by fear or jealousy or ambition." Victoria made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't how it was supposed to happen. Alexander is mine. We were promised to each other, promises made by men who are now dead," Alexander said firmly. "And based on a lie, besides. Victoria, what you feel for me isn't love. It's possession. And what you've done, double quotes." He shook his head, disgust clear in his voice. "How many people have died because of your obsession?" Victoria's face crumpled, and suddenly she looked very young and very lost. "I only wanted to be loved," she whispered. "No," Isabel said gently but firmly. "You wanted to be chosen above all others, regardless of the cost. That's not the same thing at all." The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of more guards and the local magistrate, who had apparently ridden through the night to investigate the reports of poisoning at the Duke's ball. As Edmund and Victoria were led away, he in defiant silence, she in hysterical tears, Alexander moved to stand beside Isabel. "Are you hurt?" he asked, gently touching the scratches on her arms where the rose thorns had caught her. "Nothing that won't heal," Isabel said, then looked up at him with sudden concern. "But you? Are you all right? Learning that people you trusted were murderers?" Alexander's smile was sad but genuine. "It's a shock, certainly. But Isabel, for the first time in my adult life, I don't feel like I'm carrying the weight of other people's deaths on my shoulders. For the first time, I can imagine a future that doesn't involve pushing away everyone I care about." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Isabel felt her cheeks warm as she looked up into those blue-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams for the past week. "Alexander," she began, then stopped. How could she possibly voice what was in her heart? The social barriers between them might as well have been made of solid stone. "Miss Laurent," Alexander said formally, then paused and shook his head. "No, Isabel." He took her hands in his, not caring who might see. "What I'm about to say will probably shock you. After tonight, I think I'm beyond being shocked by anything," Isabel said with a shaky laugh. "I love you," Alexander said simply. "I know it's impossible. I know there are a dozen reasons why it could never work, but I love you. You're the bravest, most compassionate, most extraordinary woman I've ever met. And I cannot imagine facing the future without you." Isabel's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. "Alexander, I know what you're going to say," he continued quickly. "The difference in our stations, the scandal it would cause. The impropriety. I was going to say, I love you too," Isabel interrupted softly. Alexander stopped mid-sentence, staring at her as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. "You what?" "I love you," Isabel repeated, stronger this time. "Not the Duke, not the title or the wealth or the prestige. I love the man who worries about his servants' well-being, who carries the weight of the world on his shoulders, who is willing to live in isolation for the rest of his life rather than risk harm coming to someone else." Alexander's hands tightened on hers. "Isabel, even if you mean that, I do. Even if you mean that," he continued, "society will never accept it. The scandal alone could destroy both of us." Isabel looked around at the garden where they stood, the garden where she had just unraveled a generations-old curse and helped expose 2 murderers. "After everything that's happened tonight, do you really think I'm afraid of a little scandal?" Alexander stared at her for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed. It was a sound of pure joy, free from the shadows that had haunted him for so long. "You magnificent, impossible woman," he said, echoing his earlier words. "Are you saying you'll marry me? Are you asking me?" "Isabel Laurent," Alexander said, dropping to one knee right there in the garden, not caring about the approaching dawn or the servants who were beginning to clear away the remnants of the ball, "will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Isabel looked down at him, this proud, powerful man kneeling in the dirt and rose petals, looking at her as if she were the answer to every prayer he'd ever uttered, and felt her last resistance crumble. "Yes," she said, and then louder, "Yes, Alexander, yes." He surged to his feet and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. When he set her down, his hands framed her face as if she were made of precious crystal. "I love you," he said again, as if he couldn't say it enough times to make up for all the years he'd believed he never could. "And I love you," Isabel replied, rising on her toes to meet him as he lowered his head to kiss her. The kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise, the first kiss of their new life together, free from curses and conspiracies and the weight of isolation that had kept them apart. When they finally broke apart, Mrs. Pembroke was standing nearby with tears in her eyes and a broad smile on her weathered face. "About time," the elderly governess said with satisfaction. "I was beginning to think you'd never figure it out," Mrs. Pembroke, Alexander said, not releasing his hold on Isabel. "I hope you'll be willing to help us plan a wedding." "It would be my absolute pleasure, Your Grace," Mrs. Pembroke replied, "though I suspect we'll have quite a few obstacles to overcome." "Let them come," Isabel said firmly, her hand finding Alexander's and intertwining their fingers. "We've faced curses and murderers. I think we can handle whatever society throws at us." Alexander brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Together, always together," Isabel promised. As the sun rose over Belmont Palace, painting the gardens in warm golden light, the Duke and his bride-tube stood hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The curse that had plagued the von Habsburg family for generations was finally broken, not by magic or ritual, but by the simple, revolutionary act of two people choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and each other over the expectations of a world that would never understand what they had found together. The scandal, when it broke, was indeed enormous. The idea of a duke marrying his personal maid sent shockwaves through polite society that took months to settle. But Alexander and Isabel weathered it all with grace, supported by those who truly mattered, Mrs. Pembroke, the loyal servants of Belmont Palace, and a surprising number of progressive nobles who had grown tired of arranged marriages and loveless unions. Their wedding 6 months later was a simple affair compared to the grand state occasion it might have been, but it was filled with genuine joy and celebration. Isabel wore her mother's pearls and a dress of ivory silk that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, a woman who, according to family legend, had also married for love rather than duty. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments of their new life together, Alexander still marveled at the miracle of finding someone who had been willing to risk everything for his sake, and if Isabel still felt amazed that love had indeed been strong enough to overcome every obstacle placed in their path, they kept those thoughts to themselves and simply concentrated on building the future they had fought so hard to claim. The curse was broken, the mysteries were solved, and love had triumphed over all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. In the end, that was all that mattered. And in the gardens of Belmont Palace, where roses bloomed more beautifully than ever before and the very stones seemed to radiate warmth and welcome, the Duke and Duchess of Belmont lived happily ever after, not because fairy tales demanded it, but because they had learned that sometimes, when two people are brave enough to fight for what they believe in, love really can conquer all.